So I don't usually make it my business to hang out in garages, but there's an event at the end of the month that actually might get me to do it even without meeting a secret source. The Garage Racing National Championships are back Saturday, February 22nd in Arlington's National Landing. What started as a quirky garage race in 2012 has since grown into a national competition drawing riders from 7 states and DC to compete underground. And the best part, it is free to watch. The Garage Racing National Championships, Saturday, February 22nd from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m., free for spectators. RSVPs encouraged at nationallanding.org/racing. See you underground. Today on CityCast DC, bike lanes, weirdly, are one of the most emotional subjects in DC. And Washington Post columnist Mark Fisher stirred up a lot of that emotion with a recent column that was sharply critical of them, or at least sharply critical of how the city has sold them. He's here to talk about the column and the wild reaction it got. Today is Monday, February 10th. I'm Michael Schaefer. Here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Mark, good to see you.
Great to be with you.
So you wrote this opinion column about bike lanes, which you've been around long enough to know is a weirdly passionate third rail in city politics. Can you sort of explain to folks your basic argument?
Bike lanes, along with dog parks for some reason, are the kind of seemingly not very meaningful urban parts of life that get people all riled up. I was tracking a couple of bike lane controversies around the city, and then I became aware of another one over in Northeast DC on South Dakota Avenue, and I thought, let's take a look at whether this issue has changed over the last 20, 30 years since first arose. And my view basically is bike lanes are great. Alternative modes of transportation are vital in a city that can't possibly depend just on cars or just on transit. But bike lanes are a political bother, at least, if not a real menace, to people who've lived in neighborhoods for a long time, neighborhoods that haven't changed much, and they see bike lanes as an invasion, as a way for the powers that be, and particularly the developers and the city government, to come in and change their neighborhood, make it more expensive, push them out. And knowing that that's the case, knowing that that's been true for decades, the bike advocates and the city planners charge ahead nonetheless. And this was a case where they had to know what this was going to cause, and they just bulled through. And what I found in the reporting for the column for the first time was people in positions of authority saying, you know what, we're doing this not just to make things easier for bike riders, we're also sort of stealthily doing this to change the city, to make the neighborhood more attractive for developers to fulfill a very reasonable goal, which is to rebuild the tax base. That's what I ended up saying.
What I thought was the most explosive part of that argument was that last bit you mentioned, which is that we have sort of a planning office. They work for the taxpayers, people who lay out roads and so on. And according to you, they were claiming to be just trying to build some bike infrastructure, but the real goal was this so-called car diet, was basically to make life tougher, less pleasant for automobiles. Whether that's a good policy or not a good policy, what seemed explosive about your charge was the fact that they were not copping to it to the general public.
Exactly. What ticked me off and what drove the column was the idea that they were being sneaky. They were trying to trick the longtime residents and taxpayers into thinking, hey, this is just about creating some transportation alternatives, when actually it was about how do we change the city. They didn't explicitly say we're going to gentrify your neighborhood, but that's the effect. They were going to come in and add the amenities that they know attract the more affluent, generally whiter population that has moved into a number of close-in city neighborhoods. Now we're out in the sort of outer stretches of the district, and they're proposing to do this along a pretty major commuter route. And I think the people who live there saw this as being double-crossed, being tricked, and they're right.
So whether they meant it or not, that's your reporting. When you did a bunch of reporting in this, showed that people interpreted this as a sort of an effort to get rid of them.
Right, to push them out, and which is the classic DC narrative. This goes back to the rumors of the plan. The plan was this sort of conspiracy theory that started as far back as the late 60s, certainly the 1970s, and it was the belief among many longtime Black residents of DC that there was a plan concocted by the major corporations and the city government and the developers to change the city from majority Black to majority white.
It worked.
It worked. Right. For many people who've lived here a long time, they look around and they say, it's exactly what's happened. Now, obviously, there was no plan, except that there was a great desire, led by Marion Barry, of all people, among others, to rebuild or build up the tax base of the city so that it could afford to provide all the many social services and other expensive things that DC is well known for, whether you like that or hate it. And it worked. I mean, Barry didn't stay in office long enough to see it to its full fruition, but it was well underway. And then when you got some mayors who had a better sense of management who came along, they made it happen, Tony Williams and Adrian Fenty. So here we are.
So people associate the gentrification controversies in the city and generally developer triumphs in the city with either with sort of downtown office canyons of the 80s or with these cute neighborhoods that were kind of upgraded in the 90s and in the 21st century. The neighborhood that you set this column is not that. This is South Dakota Avenue. I've always sort of thought of it as like the backbone of middle-class Black Washington. Can you to sort of just describe the neighborhood both physically and culturally for people who haven't been there?
This is the heart of Northeast Washington. This is the neighborhoods where you can drive up and down the side streets and pass dozens of row houses with green and white metal awnings. And those were always the symbol to me of that kind of long-standing Black Washingtonian, people who are proud to be multi-generational Washingtonians who have always looked askance at newcomers to the city, whether Black or white, and who've always believe that it's their city and their school system and their police department and so on. So these are the neighborhoods where mostly working class people, a lot of government employees, particularly city government. And these are among the neighborhoods that Marion Barry had his base in and really protected those folks and arranged for them to get jobs and so on. It's a neighborhood that has not changed very much, even as that gentrification wave hit not only downtown, but the close-in neighborhoods of Shaw, Adams Morgan, Mount Pleasant, all the way up to Petworth and so on. Not to Northeast, not to the part of the city kind of between Catholic University and the Maryland border. And when that population sees this kind of change coming, they have a lot to compare it to in other parts of the city where they saw longtime Black residents being priced out. And sometimes that meant making money on your house and moving out to Prince George's County, kind of a suburban dream come true. And sometimes it meant not being able to afford to stay in the city and struggling to find a place to live in the metropolitan area.
So when you channeled the point of view of residents near South Dakota Avenue, this did not please a lot of people. The responses have been wild. Can you sort of characterize them a little bit? Tell us some of them.
I'd say a small majority of the responses have been, thank you. We can't stand these bike lanes. We just fought this battle on Connecticut Avenue against the bike lanes and we won. But the city is avaricious about this. The bike lanes seem to be just spreading all over town. And then a much more vocal and angry, but significant minority. I mean, 45% of the responses were, you're thinking about this all wrong. This is not an invasion. This is a way to bring amenities to all people, not just rich white people who like to ride bikes on the weekends. Biking is the future of transportation in the city. It's the only way we'll slow or remove traffic from the streets, car traffic, that is. And you're playing the race card unfairly and without any factual basis.
In times like these, times that feel kind of dark, I constantly find myself leaning into art and history for inspiration. The arts can provide solace from the seemingly constant barrage of bad news, and history can give us hope and light and show us a path forward. That's why this month, I can't wait to see Fuente Ovejuna at the Gala Theater. Fuente Ovejuna tells the story of a town where women lead an uprising against a tyrant, taking up arms and confronting the authorities. It's one of Spain's most famous plays by the legendary Lope de Vega, and it's headed at Gala by award-winning director Jose Luis Arellano. Witness the people rise up against oppression. The show is in Spanish with English surtitles and runs February 6th through March 2nd. Get more information and tickets at galatheater.org. That's galatheater.org. CityCast is made possible by the Peabody Institute of the Johns Hopkins University, celebrating 1 year of performances at the university's Bloomberg Center, located at 555 Pennsylvania Avenue in D.C. This spring, immerse yourself in the vibrant offerings at DC's newest venue for music and dance. Featuring a full season of free performances, experience a dynamic range of events, including orchestral, jazz, and chamber music, all presented by esteemed Peabody faculty, students, alumni, and special guests. Highlights of the season include Songs from Inside on February 14th, a chamber choral performance highlighting the experiences of incarcerated writers in history and the present, and Load Bang on April 30th, a music chamber ensemble performing works by Peabody composition faculty, Guggenheim Fellows, and Pulitzer Prize finalist Felipe Lara. While all events are free, tickets are required for entry. Explore the full performance schedule, find out more details, and reserve your tickets at washingtondc.jhu.edu.
You know, this is a thing that we've touched on our podcast, and it was in your column too, is, you were someone who's covered the District of Columbia over a bunch of different incarnations. I was a child of the 70s and 80s here myself, and I'm just baffled by the kind of political, tone deafness of the advocates that you write about. Not that there's anything wrong with the policy point of view, but that when, but doing something without sort of head-on addressing the anxieties of, people who don't look like you, people who may not be in physically as good shape as you, people who may not work in the kind of job where you can show up being all sweaty and find a back room to change in. What do you make of that?
You hit it right on the head. That is exactly what's baffling about this. And I had lengthy discussions with people from the Washington Area Bicyclist Association. And I said, why do you present yourselves as these sort of warriors for bicycles against the rest of the city? Why do you use phrases like traffic violence? You know what traffic violence means to the bike advocates? It's another way of saying car drivers. They use extraordinarily antagonistic language, and the righteousness with which they make their arguments for bike lanes is almost guaranteed to turn people against them. And they have good arguments. It really does help to have alternative modes of transportation to reduce car traffic. That was the whole theory behind the metro system being built, and it's worked. I started off the column by saying Washington will never be Amsterdam or Portland when it comes to having giant fleets of bikes rolling across the city. And the bike advocates pushed back and said, why not? Of course it will be like Amsterdam and Portland. Well, that's not going to happen. I mean, this is a suburban-oriented metropolitan area where a lot of people drive in from the suburbs, and they're not going to switch over to bicycles, especially if they're older or live at a great distance. And no matter how many bike lanes you build, you're not going to be able to create that kind of an intimate network of lanes that you can build downtown, that you can build in tightly, densely populated areas. So it's just an unrealistic and deeply antagonistic approach.
So when you put this to them, you said, why are you guys being so antagonistic? What was the response?
First, denial. No, we're not. We want everybody. We do so have black bike riders. We do so have bike riders who are not wealthy. And so there's a lot of no, we don't, yes, you do kind of stuff going on. But then when you get beyond that and try to push them on it, they'll admit that some of the language is not exactly neighborhood friendly, not exactly working to their advantage. They'll talk about all the ways in which the system is rigged against them and how the city doesn't really believe in it as a government in the bike lanes, although certainly the evidence in recent years is that they very much do believe in it. They believe that this is almost a generational battle, and they think young people of all flavors and stripes are on their side. That may be true to some extent, but there are an awful lot of young people who live in those outer neighborhoods who do drive into work or who do take metro and find that the behavior of bicyclists is something that really rubs them the wrong way. And so from the anti-bike lane side, you get a similar kind of hopped up rhetoric about how bike riders don't adhere to traffic rules, how they're constantly swerving in front of you, cutting you off, all of that stuff. So these are two sides that simply do not talk to each other.
Well, right. And I don't think that the bike advocates politically should have to answer for the behavior of some knucklehead who may not have anything to do with their politics, but they do control their messaging. I'm curious also in terms of responses, when you went to the city and said, listen, I think you guys are sneakily pushing one policy while claiming to push another. What was the response you got there?
They deny having any stealth agenda, and this is all part of a holistic approach to transportation. They don't have any secret deals with developers to have bike lanes pave the way for higher end apartment building. So they deny all of that. And yet, when you're not on the record with them, they will say, yes, we do very much want to rebuild. We need to rebuild the tax base. Downtown is suffering terribly from remote work and the subsequent emptying of office buildings and loss of retail downtown. So they're looking to boost the tax base around the city, and particularly in residential neighborhoods. And one way to do that is to provide the convenience, the amenities that people want. And some of those young, more affluent folks who want to live as close in as they can, but can't afford to be all the way near downtown, may be attracted to neighborhoods like South Dakota Avenue if there are bike lanes and if there are good parks and nice playing fields, all the things that the longtime Black residents always wanted and never got. And now suddenly they see being built not for them.
So I guess I'll go back to where I started, which is what is it about the bicycle of all things that is so unique to DC and so like uniquely able to trigger people?
On many of these tough issues in the District of Columbia, there's kind of a natural instinct to look first to questions of race and class because they have so dominated the political discussions and the social divisions within this city for so long. And if you look at this issue through that prism, you start to get some answers. And the answers involve who is this city for? It's clearly not the chocolate city of the 1970s and 80s. It's no longer a majority Black city. It's not anywhere close to being a majority white city. It's become a much more diverse city. And I think overall, there's a lot of unsettled feeling about who can afford to be here and who's wanted here. And those are economic issues that go right to the cost of housing, the cost of living, bike lanes, dog parks. These are convenient symbols for those issues. Just like we talk about the price of eggs to represent what inflation has done to our country, I think you talk about bike lanes and dog parks as something that stereotypically only appeals to the invaders, the newcomers, the affluent whites. Of course, there are exceptions to that. Of course, there are plenty of Black people who use bike lanes. But that's the overwhelming perception, especially among older Washingtonians. And it works because the advocates on both sides play along with that and play into that stereotype.
It struck me reading your piece that there's also a kind of, I don't know, like overly mechanical emphasis on equity going on, which is that the logic is, and it's only fair, we want to do the same for all neighborhoods. You know, if you think bike lanes are a good thing, we want to give all neighborhoods equal access to this amenity. The problem there is that it sort of ignores geography, which is that some neighborhoods are physically further away from where most offices are. Obviously, there's exceptions. There's offices everywhere, but where most offices are. And so whether you're talking about up in, Far Ward 3, where I grew up, or you're talking about South Dakota Avenue, statistically, there's just going to be fewer people who want to bike 6 miles to the office than 2 miles to the office, no matter what their race or class. But as all these conversations always do get back to equity, weirdly, they're doing in the name of equity what they're now being accused of doing in the name of inequity.
That's true, and that's something we could collectively raise the blood pressure of the bike advocates by pointing that out, and they're not happy with me. But it's an important discussion. Sadly, it's a discussion that's gone on for 2 or 3 decades without much improvement in relations between the two sides, and without any clear solution. I mean, every time the city proposes another major extension of the bike lane network, there's just another battle as if the whole thing was starting fresh. And that to me says you haven't fixed the issue, you haven't dealt with what is dividing people, and yet no one seems any closer to having that discussion in a useful way.
But in your reporting, did you actually come across any smart or reasonable solutions that would enable the city to cut through this toxicity?
Well, it depends on what your goal is. Yes, there are ways, and you don't have to look far. You can look directly across the Potomac River at Arlington, Virginia, which is a county that, in its more densely populated areas, has done a really impressive job of calming the traffic. So the bike lane advocates have said that their main goal here, the whole idea of the road diet, is to slow down cars so that we see less reckless driving, fewer pedestrian injuries and deaths. You can do that, as Arlington has, by bumping out the curbs so that people have to slow down when they're driving. The lanes become quite narrow, uncomfortably narrow. They expand the sidewalks, widen the sidewalks. The city's done a little bit of that as part of the streeteries movement, especially in Georgetown, with great success. And so there are places around the city where those kinds of moves can work. It doesn't do much for the bike riders, but it does help achieve what they say is their main goal, which is safer streets and fewer problems for pedestrians. So there are things you can do. Now, are bike lanes compatible with everything else we want on our streets? It depends on the street. When you have a giant boulevard like Connecticut Avenue, which many suburbanites treat as an extension of the Beltway as they barrel into town, there are any number of things you can do to slow them down. You're not going to have speed bumps on Connecticut Avenue, but you might narrow the street at certain points, especially in heavily populated retail areas.
And that's a place where a bike lane was killed by, rich white people.
Well, rich white people, but also by merchants, many of whom live in the suburbs,
Yes, true.
small business owners who felt, I think correctly, that by putting in the bike lanes and having the traffic flow and the number of lanes available for cars and eliminating a lot of the parking, you're going to destroy some of the little remaining mom and pop kinds of shops that line Connecticut Avenue. So that was a legitimate and powerful argument. And yes, they had rich white residents of the area on their side, but that coalition, I think, managed to push back against the bike lanes in a successful way. In South Dakota Avenue, you don't have that. It's almost entirely residential, and you don't have rich people pushing for anything over there.
So I came away from this column. It's just one of those things that made me think this is why we can't have nice things. There are these things that I think everyone would agree they want. Like, we want nicer parks. We want more and better grocery stores. It'd be nice to have a little cafe in my neighborhood. And yet when these things that are signs of vitality and economic health, when they open, they also are a signal to some people, accurately or not, that you're not necessarily welcome here anymore, or that this neighborhood may soon become a harder place for you to hold on.
As we said earlier, many of these issues in D.C. boil down to the central paradox of gentrification and boil down to race and class and equity. And that's the case here, too. Nice things should be available to everyone. Nice things also represent a more expensive way of living. Nice things also represent the people who can afford that more expensive way of living. And those people tend to be different from the people who are already in those neighborhoods by definition, because the people already in those neighborhoods were living in houses they've owned for decades or prices locked in. So it is a problem that all cities face. The district is facing it over a more extended period than most, and perhaps in a more dramatic way than most. It's been decades since the city had a substantial middle class. It has been a city of great division economically for a long time. The affluent people who could afford million-dollar houses and the people who depend on the city for services and jobs, and there's not a ton in between. And that has made these issues starker and more emotionally troubling than in many other cities.
The other division, I mean, it's related, that you describe is one of age. The age groups who are most passionate about it are different than the age groups of the folks you were writing about on South Dakota Avenue.
Right. And that generational divide is part of the reason why it's bike lanes and dog parks that become the symbols of this battle. Bike lanes for obvious physical ability reasons, dog parks less obvious. Certainly people of all ages have dogs, but dog parks have come to be associated with younger people for some reason. I don't really understand it. But little that brings people together across generations in this city, and there's a lot that divides them. And I haven't seen any effort to recognize that issue, let alone combat it.
Mark, thank you for being here.
Anytime.
And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, tell someone who has strong feelings about bike lanes, pro or con. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.